Trump is forgetting that NATO is 32 nations, including America.
And I'm going to welcome now to the studio in the programme Larissa Brown, the defence editor for The Times. Hi to you, Larissa. Good to see you.
Hello.
Thank you for joining me. Can I ask you, first of all, what is the latest news on the seized oil tanker?
Well, as far as I'm aware, we're expecting it actually to be taken to America, according to a source I spoke to about 10 minutes ago. There was some suggestion that it might be brought to the UK, but I'm told that won't be the case. And obviously, we've just heard from the White House. They've said that they're expecting members of the vessel to potentially be prosecuted in the United States.
Yes, indeed. I mean, and the cargo, obviously the initial expectation would be that this was oil. This was sanctioned oil. Since then, there have been doubts about that. Can you tell us more?
My understanding is that there's nothing on the vessel. There isn't any oil. And from the UK government perspective, it was a stateless vessel, and this is part of a wider crackdown on the Russian shadow fleet. And actually, the UK MOD, the sources that I've been speaking to today, have really been keen to point out that this isn't part of, from their perspective, this isn't a sort of fight against the Venezuelan situation. This is all about Russia.
Okay, I just briefly a thought on this confrontation, which so far seems to have passed off relatively smoothly, as far as that's possible. A confrontation of this kind at sea, maybe in particular, there has to be some vestige of worry about escalation, maybe even accidental escalation.
Yes, and I think that was a great fear inside the MOD this morning. Initial conversations that I was having, I was actually trying to talk to people about Ukraine, and they were saying to me, look, everybody's really worried about this situation that's happening with the tanker, because there were reports that Putin had sent a submarine to guard the tanker, and obviously there were fears that there could be a wider escalation and a confrontation between the Americans and the Russians, and obviously at that point people inside the MOD were also preparing for the UK to take part in that operation.
Wow, it's pretty scary stuff. I mean, you know this stuff far better than I do, which isn't very difficult. But it doesn't take an order from the Kremlin or the White House to kick things off, does it? You've got various commanders at sea confronting each other in very tense circumstances. Something can just happen.
Exactly, and it could be, a potentially extremely volatile situation. And you're right, just one thing could happen, and then if somebody decides to fire, then that's it. We're on the brink of World War III.
Okay. What's your latest thinking on Greenland? We heard the word of the White House overnight saying that the idea of military action over Greenland, to get hold of Greenland, was still on the table, which is a fairly vague form of words, but enough to worry people. And we also heard we heard from Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, a moment ago, saying, look, diplomacy, deal-making is what we really want here, which is pretty much what he clearly told members of Congress overnight. What's your take on where we are?
I think I spoke to some NATO sources earlier, and from the perspective in the alliance, they're quite confident that actually the Americans wouldn't carry out any military operation to seize Greenland. I think there are wider fears that there'll be a lot of pressure on Denmark to enter into some sort of deal with America. But I think although obviously everyone's very alarmed by these discussions, I think ultimately people are really hoping that cool heads will prevail and Trump wouldn't do such a thing.
Larissa Brown, defence editor for The Times. Thank you so much. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Now, let's say hi to General Sir Richard Shirreff, who's a former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. Hello to you, General.
Good evening, John. How are you?
I'm well, and always good to have you here. Let me just first of all put to you, there's so much we could discuss, but the most recent Truth social media post from the president, and you can read it in many different ways, which is no doubt what he intends. It's only been, I suppose, the effect looking at it, where the president writes, Russia and China have zero fear of NATO without the United States. We will always be there for NATO. And then he says, I doubt NATO would be there for us. So it's in one breath, supportive and dismissive. What do you think?
Blimey, let's unpack that. First of all, it makes it sound as if somehow America is not part of NATO. Trump is forgetting that NATO is 32 nations, including America. And he's also forgetting that even the most powerful American nation, America, is stronger militarily and politically by being part of the alliance. So and that's the second thing is, of course, NATO is going to be there. The rest of NATO is going to be there for America. As America may not be there for the rest of NATO, but all European countries and Canada would absolutely be there for America. That is, providing they trust America. And with Trump flailing around, making threats to NATO territories such as Greenland, people will be forgiven for being a little bit skeptical about that.
Yeah, well, indeed. And that is especially relevant when you look at what happened overnight. The various supporters, friends of Ukraine coming together in the so-called Coalition of the Willing to put together a plan for a multi-nation force to cooperate in overseeing a ceasefire in Ukraine when there is a ceasefire. But a lot of it rests on the promise of an American security guarantee, monitoring the line of contact, making sure there's no breach in the agreement on the ground. That's the American promise, and to defend the deal. I wonder how much faith the Friends of Ukraine and Ukraine can have in those American guarantees, given all you're pointing out.
Absolutely right. But if we're talking about the declaration of intent, of course, the first requirement is for a ceasefire.
Sure.
And for that to happen, Russia has got to accept it. And there's nothing coming from Putin. What was notably missing last night was the need to think enemy, think things from Putin's perspective. He's not saying anything that suggests that he's prepared to give up his maximalist demands. So therefore, he will need, and the Russians will need, to be forced into a ceasefire. If that happens, which we're a long way from, any form of peace enforcement force has got to be capable of enforcing peace. And that means being prepared to fight Russia. It means absolutely American backup. And the security guarantees that were sort of talked about but rather glossed over in detail last night have got to be cast down and solid. And America has got to be 100% back as a part of that. But the noise about Greenland, of course, creates doubt. It raises issues about trust in America. And so the whole thing is in a sense, a pack of cards.
Well, I mean, among the points you make there, I don't think we're in the business, or are we, of the International Coalition of the Willing getting into the business of fighting with Russia. We're talking about a few thousand troops so far. The sources of those troops that have been mentioned as most likely are Britain and France, but we are talking about a few thousand troops operating well away from the front line, or what was the front line. They'd be busy training troops. They'd be busy guarding borders. There'd be surveillance at sea. There'd be surveillance in the air. But the plan is not to directly engage Russian forces who transgress and cross the line, is it, General?
Well, all I can say is that if the force the so-called reassurance force that was discussed last night, again, the detail was very sketchy.
Yes.
If it is, as you suggested, is likely to be, then it's going to be completely useless. Because absolutely sure as eggs is eggs, even if Russia is forced into a ceasefire, it will absolutely break that ceasefire.
Yes.
And the only way to make Russia back off is to enforce it. And that means being ready to fight Russia. And that means having a force that can overmatch Russia, has serious military capability, land, sea, and air, and the political will to use it if necessary.
So do you believe it would need, well, I mean, the force that was mentioned last night at the news conference in Paris was of 800,000 Ukrainian troops who would be a standing army, effectively, and part of the business of guarding Ukrainian territory when a ceasefire came. But you think we need to see a much, much bigger presence of those international forces on Ukrainian territory than just a few thousand.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, of course, Ukraine will bear the brunt, and Ukraine, let's be clear, has got the largest army, the most combat-ready army, and the most combat-experienced army in Europe, and they've been fighting the Russians for 4 years. But if any ceasefire is to be implemented, it's got to be enforced by the wider international community to make it happen. And that means, as I said, capable, ready forces, capable of fighting Russia if necessary.
Yeah, but this operation, the peacekeeping operation you described, does amount to an enormous additional strain on the defence budget of this country and other NATO members, which are already scraping and scrambling, without a very, very clear final successful destination, to build up our defence spending and our defence capabilities. The British plan, well, it was announced relatively recently. We were spending 2.3% of GDP of national earnings on defence. That goes up to 2.5%. Now, just the move that's been announced involved cutting overseas aid to the bone, but the argument goes that that's not nearly enough. And the target of 3% of national earnings by the 30s is either too late or not big enough, and probably both.
John, the sound of chickens coming home to roost is deafening. People like me have been saying for years that we have been underspending on defence, and now the rubber's hitting the road big time, and Labour's carrying the challenge. And despite all the talk about increased defence budgets, you may have heard Ben Wallace on the radio this morning saying that the plan is to take $1 billion out of the army this year. What price that with all the other talk about increased defence spending? Where was the talk about increasing defence spending mentioned as a priority in any way in the last budget? Not at all. It was all about welfare. Defence wasn't mentioned at all. And now Labour's got to make some tough decisions about it. And if they're serious about getting involved in any form of peace enforcement in Ukraine, which frankly they should be and must be, because it's existential for European security, there's got to be some real sacrifice in order to put in place the means to achieve the ends required.
That is such an important thought. There's a wonderful old quote from the former Labour Prime Minister Jim Callaghan. He said, "The skies have grown black with the wings of chicken coming home to roost." Unforgettable. And it seems pretty prescient. General Sir Richard Shirreff, former NATO Deputy Supreme Commander for Europe, thank you.